At 0700 hours on the morning of January 24th, 1945, the world was a frozen hellscape of white snow and black earth. First Lieutenant Garland Merle Connor stood shivering in the commandeered farmhouse that served as the forward command post for the 3rd Battalion 7th Infantry Regiment. He was staring out a shattered window, his breath pluming in the frigid air, watching the devastating efficiency of German artillery as it pulverized the tree line a mere 400 yards to his front. Connor was 25 years old, though his eyes held the weary, haunted look of a man twice that age. He was the Battalion Intelligence Officer, or S2, a role that theoretically should have kept him safe behind a desk analyzing maps. But theory had long ago been discarded in the brutal reality of the Colmar Pocket. He had only recently returned from a field hospital, his body still knitting itself back together from wounds received weeks prior. He was not a physically imposing figure. Standing 5'6" and weighing a scant 120 pounds, he looked more like a malnourished teenager than a seasoned warrior. He was a tobacco farmer from Clinton County, Kentucky, a man of the earth who had never finished high school because the nearest classroom was a prohibitive 15 miles from his family's homestead. Yet, this unassuming farmer had become one of the most lethal instruments of the 7th Infantry. He had enlisted in March 1941, months before Pearl Harbor would drag the United States fully into the global conflagration. Since then, he had endured 4 agonizing years of war. He had survived 10 major campaigns and stormed 4 hostile beaches in amphibious assaults. He had been wounded 7 times. The most recent piece of shrapnel had sent him to the hospital 3 weeks ago, but he had gone AWOL from the medical ward to return to his brothers in the battalion just 2 days prior. He could not sit in a warm bed while his men froze in the foxholes of Alsace. The strategic situation was dire. The 3rd Battalion was holding a precarious section of the front line on the northern edge of the Colmar Pocket. This pocket was a festering wound in the Allied lines, the last major German stronghold on French soil. It was a thumb of territory, 850 square miles of dense, frozen forests and hardened farm fields west of the Rhine River, occupied by the fanatical remnants of the German 19th Army. The Germans had dug in here since November, turning every village into a fortress and every tree line into a kill zone. The French First Army had thrown thousands of men into the meat grinder trying to collapse the pocket, but every attempt had failed, resulting in staggering casualties. To understand the desperation of this moment, one must understand the timing. Operation Nordwind had launched on New Year's Day, the Third Reich's last major offensive in the West. While the world watched the Battle of the Bulge rage 300 miles to the north, Adolf Hitler had ordered Army Group G to smash through the thinner American lines in Alsace. The goal was to sever the Allied supply lines and recapture the symbolic city of Strasbourg. While the main thrust of Nordwind had been blunted, the Germans in the Colmar Pocket remained a potent, coiled snake ready to strike, and they were desperate. They were fighting with their backs to the Rhine, defending the very doorstep of the fatherland. 3rd Battalion had been on the line for 18 grueling days without relief. The physical conditions were nearly uninhabitable. Temperatures plummeted to an average of 10 degrees below zero. There was no moonlight to illuminate the threats that lurked in the darkness. Snow covered everything, hiding mines and tripwires. Soldiers slept in frozen foxholes, chipping away at the rock-hard earth with bayonets, huddled together for warmth like livestock. Frostbite was claiming almost as many men as enemy fire. German patrols, clad in winter white camouflage, probed the American positions every night, looking for weakness. The battalion had already bled, losing 43 men in 2 weeks, mostly to the terrifying randomness of artillery and the silent efficiency of snipers. Connor's job in the command post was vital. As the intelligence officer, he was the brain of the battalion. He gathered information on enemy movements, interrogated shivering prisoners, analyzed patrol reports, and marked German positions on the acetate overlays of his maps. By doctrine, it was not a combat role. Intelligence officers were assets to be preserved. They stayed back, they planned, they did not lead charges. But Garland Connor had never read the rulebook on self-preservation. During his 4 years of war, he had earned 4 silver stars for direct combat action, a staggering achievement. October 1943 inches, the mountains of Italy. January 1944 on the bloody beaches of Anzio. September 1944 inches, the hedgerows of France. And now, February 1945. and 45. Each silver star represented a moment where Connor had looked death in the face and refused to blink, risking his life to pull others from the fire. He had a reputation in the 3rd Battalion. When the situation turned hopeless, when the line was breaking, Connor moved forward. At 0715, the rhythm of the morning changed. The sporadic German artillery fire suddenly intensified into a drumroll of destruction. It was a preparation barrage. Shells walked across the battalion's forward positions with mathematical precision. Trees exploded into deadly splinters. Fountains of dirt and frozen earth erupted into the gray sky. The ground shook with a violence that rattled the teeth of the men in the command post. The barrage lasted for 12 agonizing minutes, just enough time to stun the defenders, to force them deep into the bottom of their holes, to sever communication wires. Then, it stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with threat. Then came the sound that every infantryman dreads more than any other. The low, guttural growl of heavy engines. The squeal of metal tracks on frozen ground. A runner burst into the command post, chest heaving, eyes wide with terror. "Germans advancing!" he screamed. "Tanks! Tigers! 6 of them! And infantry! Hundreds of them!" The report was a death sentence. The enemy force was moving through the woods toward the battalion's left flank, the weakest point in the line. The German 19th Army had massed a Kampfgruppe, a battle group of 600 elite infantry troops, supported by 6 Mark VI Tiger tanks. The Mark VI Tiger was not just a tank, it was a legend of terror. Weighing nearly 60 tons, heavily armored, and armed with the fearsome 88mm WK-36 gun, it was the apex predator of the 1945 battlefield. The 88mm gun could slice through an American Sherman tank from a mile away like a hot knife through butter. Its frontal armor was so thick that most Allied anti-tank weapons simply bounced off. To see 1 Tiger was a nightmare. To see 6 was a catastrophe. The battalion commander looked at the map, his face pale. If those Tigers reached the American positions, they would simply roll over the foxholes, crushing the men inside or burying them alive. The battalion would be overrun in minutes. There were no American Shermans in position to challenge them. No tank destroyers were available. The terrain and the weather had grounded tactical air support. The battalion was alone. The only weapon in the American arsenal that could conceivably stop 6 Tigers was artillery. But artillery is a blind giant. It requires eyes. It needs a forward observer, someone positioned at the very front who can see the enemy, calculate coordinates, and radio corrections to the guns miles in the rear. But the morning barrage had done its work. The forward observation posts had been obliterated. The observers were either dead or critically wounded. From the safety of the command post, no one could see the German advance. The dense, snow-laden fir trees blocked the view entirely. Connor studied the map, his mind racing through the geometry of the battlefield. The German advance was coming through a specific sector of woods, funneling toward the battalion's flank. To observe the attack, to get eyes on the Tigers, someone would have to leave the command post. They would have to run 400 yards across, open, flat ground, a killing field with 0 cover. They would have to do this under the renewed German artillery fire. And once they crossed that hell, they would have to stay in position, ahead of the American line, while 6 60-ton monsters and 600 infantrymen advanced directly toward them. It was a suicide mission. There was no other way to describe it. Connor didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for volunteers. He didn't look for a lower-ranking soldier to send to his death. He simply picked up a field telephone and a spool of wire containing 400 yards of cable. He looked at the battalion commander, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Then, he turned and walked out of the command post, into the biting cold. The German artillery barrage had paused, but Connor knew the rhythm of the Wehrmacht. It would resume. The Germans always fired a preparation barrage, waited for their infantry to close the distance, and then the guns would open up again to pin down the defenders, while the Tigers moved in for the kill. This was the creeping barrage tactic, refined over years of war. Connor began to run 400 yards. It doesn't sound like a long distance. On a track field, it is 1 lap, a minute of running, but on the frozen ground of Alsace, carrying a heavy cable spool in one hand and a telephone handset in the other, wearing heavy winter gear, it was an eternity. The snow had a crust of ice on top. With every step, his boots broke through, sinking into the powder beneath, sapping his energy, throwing off his balance. The wire unspooled behind him. a thin black line connecting him to the only hope the battalion had. He made it 100 yards before the German guns opened fire again. The enemy observers, hidden in the tree line, had spotted the lone figure dashing across the white expanse. A single American soldier running toward their attack, it must have seemed insane to them. But they wasted no time. Shells began to land. The first salvo hit 40 yards to his left, sending a spray of black dirt and snow into the air. Then 30 yards to his right. They were bracketing him, adjusting their aim to trap him in the center. A shell hit a tree 70 yards ahead of him. The trunk disintegrated. Razor-sharp splinters of frozen wood, as deadly as shrapnel, showered down around him. Connor didn't flinch. He kept his head down and his legs pumping. Another shell landed 20 yards behind him. The concussion wave hit him like a physical blow, a giant invisible fist slamming into his back. He stumbled, nearly face-planting into the snow, but recovered. He did not fall. The wire kept unspooling. At 250 yards, a shell destroyed a tree directly in his path. The massive trunk split down the middle with a crack like a thunderclap, crashing across the snow in front of him. Connor didn't stop to go around. He vaulted over the fallen timber, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Shrapnel had torn through the branches. Pieces of hot, jagged metal hissed as they buried themselves in the snow, melting small pockets in the ice. Another shell. This one was closer, 15 yards to his left. The earth geysered up. Chunks of frozen dirt rained down on his helmet and shoulders. The blast wave hammered his eardrums, shattering his hearing. The world went mute, replaced by a high-pitched, screaming ring. He could no longer hear his own boots crunching in the snow. He could no longer hear his own ragged breathing. He just ran. He reached the American front line at the 300-yard mark. Soldiers crouched, deep in their foxholes, helmets barely visible. They stared up at him as he sprinted past. An intelligence officer, an officer who should be at a desk, running times toward times the enemy with a telephone. It made no sense. He didn't stop to explain. He didn't dive into a foxhole for safety. He kept running forward, beyond the safety of the line, toward the approaching Tigers. 30 yards beyond the furthest American foxhole, Connor found his position. It wasn't a bunker. It wasn't a fortified observation post. It was a shallow irrigation ditch, barely a depression in the earth. Maybe 18 inches deep. It was not deep enough to stop bullets. It was certainly not deep enough to protect against the shrapnel of an artillery shell, but it was all there was. It offered just enough cover to keep his silhouette below the snow level while giving him a clear sightline toward the German advance. He threw himself into the ditch, the frozen ground hard as concrete against his ribs. He checked the wire. It had held. He cranked the handle on the field telephone. The connection buzzed a sound of pure salvation. Then, a voice. The Fire Direction Center, FDC. Located 3 miles behind the front line, the FDC controlled a battery of 105mm howitzers, 12 guns in total. This was enough firepower to shatter an attack, provided the shells landed in the exact right square footage of the earth. Connor gave his position. The Fire Direction officer confirmed. Connor was now the eyes of the 3rd Battalion's artillery. The entire fate of the unit, perhaps the entire sector, rested on his ability to see, to calculate, and to speak clearly while the world exploded around him. He raised his head slowly above the rim of the ditch. The sight that greeted him chilled his blood faster than the winter air. The German infantry were 200 yards away. They were moving through the trees in professional squad formations, rifles at the high port. They advanced in short, disciplined rushes, one squad moving while another provided covering fire. These were not conscripts. These were veterans. They knew how to assault a fixed position. And behind them, the Tigers. Connor could see 4 of them now. Massive, blocky shapes, painted in winter whitewash, barely distinguishable from the snow. They were 60-ton monsters pushing through the smaller trees as if they were matchsticks. The Tigers stayed just inside the tree line, using the forest for concealment. But they were coming. Slow, methodical, inevitable. The sound of their engines was a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated through the ground into Connor's chest. The German infantry had not seen him yet. He was a ghost in a ditch, alone, 30 yards ahead of the American line, with a telephone and 600 German soldiers walking directly toward him. Connor lifted the handset. He spoke the coordinates clearly. Fire mission. Enemy infantry in the open. At 600 meters. adjusting. The physics of artillery are unforgiving. The first shells would take approximately 40 seconds to travel the 3 miles from the guns to the target. In those 40 seconds, a man can run 200 yards. A lot can happen. If the Germans spotted him before the shells landed, they would kill him instantly. If the shells landed too close to his position, they would kill him just as dead as the Germans would. If the shells landed too far away, the attack would continue, and the 3rd Battalion would be massacred. Connor watched the Germans advance. He counted the seconds in his head, syncing his internal clock with the flight time of the shells. 38, 39, 40. The sky screamed. 12 105mm shells slammed into the tree line 150 yards behind the German infantry. Too far. The range estimation had been off. Connor grabbed the handset instantly. Drop 100. Fire for effect. The German infantry kept coming. They hadn't even flinched. Artillery landing behind an advance was considered normal. It meant the defenders were guessing, firing blind. The Germans assumed they had time before the Americans could correct their aim. But Connor wasn't guessing. He could see every German soldier. He could see the vapor of their breath. He could see the squad leaders signaling with their hands. The second salvo arrived 18 seconds later. This time, the math was perfect. The shells landed squarely in the middle of the German formation. The forest erupted. Trees disintegrated into sawdust. Shrapnel screamed through the air in a chaotic web of death. The 105mm shells carried 14 pounds of high explosive each. With 12 shells arriving at once, that was 168 pounds of high-grade military explosives detonating simultaneously among men packed into attack formations. German soldiers disappeared in pink mist. Others went down, clutching limbs. The advance shuddered and stopped. Connor cranked the handset. Repeat fire. Same coordinates. Another salvo. Then another. The American guns were firing for effect. Now, maximum rate of fire. 4 rounds per minute per gun. That meant 48 heavy shells every 60 seconds were hammering the same 200 square yards of forest. The German infantry scattered. Their discipline broke. Squad formations disintegrated as men ran for cover, diving behind trees, crawling into shell craters, desperate to escape the rain of steel. The forest had been transformed into a slaughterhouse. But the Tigers were still coming. Connor could see all 6 now. They had broken out of the tree line and were entering the open ground. The artillery had decimated the infantry, but 105mm high explosive shells were useless against the frontal armor of a Tiger tank. The shells exploded harmlessly against the thick steel plates, barely scratching the paint. The tanks advanced in a wedge formation, the Panzerkeil. 2 in front, 2 following, 2 bringing up the rear. Tank commanders stood in the open hatches of their turrets, scanning for targets with binoculars, looking for the American positions to engage. One of the Tigers fired. The 88mm gun cracked like a thunderbolt. The shell velocity was supersonic. The explosion happened almost instantly. It hit an American foxhole 300 yards to Connor's right. Dirt, snow, and equipment exploded upward. The soldiers in that foxhole were gone, erased in a millisecond. Another Tiger fired. Another foxhole obliterated. The Tigers were 300 yards from the American line. In 4 minutes, at their current speed, they would be on top of the foxholes. Once they crossed the defensive line, the 3rd Battalion would collapse. Tiger panic was a real phenomenon. The utter psychological terror caused by these machines often caused inexperienced troops to rout. If the Americans ran, the Germans would pursue. It would be a slaughter. The entire front sector could collapse, opening a hole for the Nordwind offensive to finally succeed. Connor shifted his fire mission. Enemy armor advancing. 250 meters. Adjust fire onto the tanks. The problem was precision. Artillery is an area weapon. It saturates a zone. It is not a sniper rifle. It is designed to kill soft targets and destroy buildings. But tanks are small, moving, hardened targets. To stop a Tiger with a 105mm howitzer, you needed a direct hit on the tracks to immobilize it, or a lucky hit on the engine deck to set it on fire. The shells started falling around the Tigers. One shell landed 10 yards in front of the lead tank. The Tiger simply drove through the blast, emerging from the smoke like a mythical beast. Another shell hit behind the formation. The Tigers ignored it. Their commanders knew that American light artillery couldn't stop them. They would drive through the barrage and crush the Americans. Connor needed the shells closer. He needed to create a wall of fire. Drop 50. Fire for effect. The next salvo landed right among the Tigers. A shell hit the lead tank's right track. The explosion shattered the heavy steel links. The track snapped, unspooling onto the snow. The tank slewed violently to the right, its momentum carrying it into a spin before it ground to a halt, immobilized. But a stationary Tiger is still a deadly pillbox. The turret traversed, the electric motor whining. The 88mm gun was still operational. It fired again, taking out another section of the American line. Another Tiger took a shell on the rear engine deck. Smoke, black and oily, began pouring from the vents. The crew might abandon it, or they might stay and fight. A disabled Tiger with a working gun was still a fortress. 4 Tigers were still moving. They had adjusted their course. They were turning. They were moving toward Connor's position. The tank commanders were not stupid. They had spotted the muzzle flashes of the artillery hitting near them. They had seen the telephone wire trailing across the snow. They realized that someone was out there, directing the fire, and they were coming to kill him. Connor checked his ditch. 18 inches of frozen earth. It was not enough to stop a machine gun bullet, let alone an 88mm high explosive shell. The Germans were 150 yards away, close enough that he could see the black and white Balkenkreuz crosses painted on the turrets. Close enough to see the grim faces of the commanders in the hatches. He lifted the handset one more time. His voice was calm, devoid of the terror that should have paralyzed him. Fire on my position. The fire direction officer on the other end hesitated. Say again? Confirm coordinates? Fire on my position, Connor repeated. Danger close. Calling artillery on your own position is the final, desperate act of a forward observer. It is strictly against standard procedure because it is essentially suicide. It means friendly shells will land within the kill radius of the observer. It means the observer is willing to die to stop the enemy. Connor confirmed a third time. 40 seconds later, the world ended. The first shells landed 30 yards in front of his ditch. The concussion wave felt like being hit by a speeding truck. The air pressure changed instantly, compressing his lungs, squeezing the air out of him. His vision blurred as his brain rattled inside his skull. Frozen dirt, rocks, and jagged shrapnel screamed overhead like angry hornets. The sound was beyond thunder. It was a physical presence that vibrated his very bones. He stayed in the ditch, curled into a ball, the handset pressed to his ear. Drop 20, repeat fire.
Repeat.
The next salvo landed 20 yards out. He could feel the heat of the explosions on his face. Shrapnel tore through the air 6 feet above his head. If he had stood up, he would have been shredded into unrecognizable meat. If the shells landed 10 yards closer, the ditch would become his grave. But the gamble worked. The Tigers stopped advancing. The tank commanders buttoned up, slamming their heavy hatches shut. The artillery was landing too close. Even a Tiger crew, protected by inches of steel, did not want to be outside their armor when American shells were detonating at point-blank range. Their vision was obscured by the smoke and flying debris. They were blind, but the German infantry was rallying. Connor could see them forming up again through the haze. A company-strength formation, maybe 200 soldiers who had survived the initial barrage. They were using the Tigers as mobile shields, staying behind the massive armored hulls, moving forward in the tank's wake. The attack was continuing. Connor adjusted fire again. He began to walk the shells back and forth across the German advance like a scythe. Every time a group of infantry tried to move forward, he dropped shells on their heads. Every time the Tigers tried to inch forward, he called for fire directly in their path. One Tiger took a direct hit on the turret roof. The shell didn't penetrate, but the concussive force damaged the turret ring mechanism. The gun jammed. The tank stopped. Another Tiger took a hit to the drive sprocket. It spun out and stuck in a crater. 3 Tigers remained operational, and the German infantry was getting closer. Connor could see individual faces now. 100 yards away, German soldiers were crawling through the snow, using shell craters for cover, moving in small, lethal groups. They were trying to flank his position. If they got around him, they could cut the telephone wire. Once the wire was cut, the artillery would stop, and the 3rd Battalion was doomed. The temperature was 10 degrees below zero, but Connor was sweating. He had been lying in that ditch for 40 minutes. His hands were numb claws. His feet were blocks of ice. Every time a shell landed close, frozen dirt buried him. He had to shake it off to see. The handset was slippery with ice and sweat, but he kept calling fire. A shell landed 15 yards to his right, then another 15 yards to his left. The Germans had him bracketed. Their artillery observers had finally pinpointed his position. They were trying to kill him with counter-battery fire. German shells and American shells were now landing in the same 100-yard radius. The ditch had become the focal point of two massive artillery barrages. Soldiers in the 3rd Battalion's foxholes watched in awe and horror. They could see the lone lieutenant lying in a ditch ahead of the line, calling death down upon himself. German shells trying to kill him. American shells landing so close that fragments were hitting the edge of his ditch. And he was not moving, he was not running, he was staying in place, adjusting fire, killing Germans. The German infantry pushed forward again, 80 yards away, close enough that Connor could hear their officers shouting commands over the din of battle, close enough to hear the metallic clack-clack of bolt-action Mauser rifles cycling rounds. He dropped the artillery another 10 yards. The shells landed between him and the advancing Germans, 60 yards from his position. The blast waves hammered him into the dirt. Debris cascaded into the ditch, burying his legs. Something hit his left shoulder, a rock or a piece of shrapnel. He couldn't tell. His shoulder went numb. He switched the handset to his right hand. The German advance stopped again. But they were not retreating. They were finding cover, waiting. They knew the American artillery observer had to be close. They knew if they could locate him, they could kill him. And once he was dead, nothing would stop them. The 3 remaining Tigers began advancing again. They spread out, putting 50 yards between each tank to make themselves harder targets. They were 200 yards from the American foxholes now. Connor called fire on the leftmost Tiger, then the center Tiger, then the right. He was splitting the artillery battery, directing guns onto multiple targets simultaneously. He was trying to damage tracks, optics, periscopes, anything to blind the beasts. One shell hit the center Tiger's front glacis plate. The armor held, but the impact rocked the 60-ton tank backward on its suspension. The driver, likely concussed or panicked, lost control momentarily. The Tiger slewed left. Its track caught on a frozen stump. The track jammed. The tank stopped. 2 Tigers still advancing, and the German infantry was inside 50 yards. The German officer leading the infantry advance was 30 yards from Connor's ditch. Connor could see the officer's face clearly. He was young, maybe 22 years old, likely a lieutenant, just like Connor. The officer was signaling his men forward with hand gestures. No shouting now, they were too close. Sound would give away their exact positions. 20 German soldiers were following him, crawling through the snow in a skirmish line. They were trying to overwhelm Connor's position from multiple angles simultaneously. Connor cranked the handset. He gave new coordinates. Drop 5. Fire for effect. The shells landed 25 yards in front of him. The German officer disappeared in the explosion. So did 4 of his soldiers. The others went flat, pressing themselves into the snow, praying for the barrage to pass. But Connor did not let it pass. He kept the shells falling. He adjusted left. He adjusted right. He created a wall of explosions between himself and the German infantry. The shells were landing so close now that hot metal fragments were landing times inside, times the ditch. One piece of shrapnel embedded itself in the frozen earth, 2 inches from his right hand. The 2 remaining Tigers had close to 150 yards from the American foxholes, close enough to use their machine guns effectively. The bowgunners opened fire. Sustained bursts from the MG-34 machine guns tore through the tree line, 792 rounds per minute. The bullets chewed through logs and kicked up snow around the American positions. Soldiers in the foxholes returned fire, but rifle bullets pinged uselessly off the Tiger's armor. It wasn't working. The Tigers kept rolling forward. Connor shifted tactics. He called for smoke shells mixed with high explosive. This smoke would obscure the Tiger's vision, blinding the drivers and gunners. The high explosive would continue to hammer their tracks. Smoke and HE. Fire for effect. White phosphorus smoke shells began landing around the Tigers. Thick, choking white clouds billowed up, instantly creating an artificial fog. The Tigers disappeared into the smoke, but they were still coming. Connor could hear the engines. He could hear the tracks grinding through the frozen earth. The smoke hadn't stopped them, it had only made them invisible. A tiger emerged from the smoke cloud, 70 yards from the foxholes. The 88mm gun fired. An American machine gun position exploded. 3 soldiers dead. Connor called fire directly on the tiger. Danger close. He specified the exact coordinates. The fire direction officer hesitated again. Those coordinates were within 50 yards of Connor's position. The shrapnel radius of a 105mm shell was 50 yards. Connor would be inside the kill zone. Connor repeated the coordinates. Send it! The shells landed. One shell hit 10 yards behind the tiger. Another hit 15 yards to the left. A third shell landed directly in front of the tank. The explosion tore into the tiger's front hull. The driver's vision port shattered. The tank swerved hard right. The driver was blind. The tiger crashed into a crater and stopped. The crew tried to back out, track spinning wildly, digging a deeper hole. The tank was stuck. One tiger remained. Connor had been in the ditch for 1 hour and 20 minutes. His assistant had joined him 40 minutes ago, a brave private from the intelligence section who had low-crawled from the foxholes with extra wire. The private was lying 5 feet to Connor's right. The private shouted, "Movement! 15 yards!" German soldiers were coming through the smoke. Connor called the coordinates. The shells landed 12 yards out. The concussion wave lifted both men off the bottom of the ditch. Dirt and ice filled the air. Something hit the private. He screamed. Shrapnel had torn through his left leg. Blood pumped onto the white snow. Connor grabbed the private and pulled him deeper into the ditch. The private was conscious, but in shock. He needed a medic, but he refused to leave. He kept his rifle ready, watching the smoke. The last tiger was 60 yards from the American line. German soldiers were inside 10 yards of Connor's position. Connor dropped artillery 5 yards in front of his ditch. The shells landed closer than any previous fire mission. The blast lifted him completely off the ground. His body slammed back into the frozen earth. His ears went deaf. Complete silence. Then the ringing started high-pitched, constant, drowning out the world. But the German soldiers, who had been 10 yards away, were gone. He cranked the handset. His hands were shaking uncontrollably from cold, shock, or exhaustion. He didn't know. The FDC officer's voice sounded faint, like he was speaking from another planet. Connor adjusted fire back onto the last tiger. The tank was 40 yards from the American foxholes. Point-blank range. The turret was traversing, looking for victims. The commander was standing in the hatch. Connor gave the coordinates. High explosive. Maximum concentration. Everything you have. 12 shells arrived simultaneously. The tiger disappeared in a storm of explosions. When the smoke cleared, the tank was still there, intact. But it wasn't moving. The vision blocks were shattered. The commander had ducked inside and slammed the hatch. The tiger was blind and immobile. The crew, realizing they were sitting ducks, popped the hatches and scrambled out. 5 men ran toward the tree line. American rifles from the foxholes cut down 3 of them. 2 escaped. All 6 tigers were destroyed or abandoned. The German armor assault had failed, but the infantry was still fighting. 400 German soldiers remained, scattered across the forest. They were veterans. They knew how to fight without tanks. Connor shifted the barrage back to them. He pursued them with artillery. He walked shells across the tree line, across the craters, across the escape routes. The FDC reported 10 minutes of ammunition remaining. The battalion commander radioed, "Withdraw. Fall back. We'll cover you." Connor stayed in the ditch. If he left now, the Germans might rally. He had to make sure they were broken. He stayed for another 20 minutes, calling shots until the guns ran dry. 3 hours after he had walked out of the command post, the German counterattack was over. Connor finally stood up. His legs barely held him. His joints were locked from the cold. He helped the wounded private up, supporting his weight. They began the long walk back to the American line. Soldiers emerged from their foxholes, staring at Connor in disbelief. They looked at the cratered moonscape where he had laid. They looked at the destroyed tigers. They looked at the bodies. The battalion commander met him. He didn't speak, he just nodded. In the aftermath, the intelligence section counted the cost. 53 German soldiers confirmed dead on the field. Another 78 wounded left behind. Estimates put total German casualties at over 150. All 6 tigers lost. 3rd Battalion had lost 11 men mostly before Connor reached the ditch. After he took control of the artillery, American casualties had effectively stopped. Connor was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. He was recommended for the Medal of Honor, but the paperwork moved too slowly. The war ended. Connor went home to Kentucky. He became a farmer again. He married Pauline. He lived a quiet life without electricity or running water. He buried his medals in a cardboard box in a closet and never spoke of them. For 50 years, the story was forgotten. It took a persistent researcher named Richard Chilton, searching for his own uncle, to uncover the truth in 1996. It took Connor's widow, Pauline, fighting the U.S. Army in federal court for another 20 years. Finally, on June 26, 20187, 3 years after that frozen morning in France, President Donald Trump presented the Medal of Honor to Pauline Connor. Garland Connor had been dead for 20 years. But his story, the story of the man who stopped an army with a telephone, had finally been told. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. It helps us save more history from being forgotten. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Let's keep Garland Connor's memory alive.